The night feels still when we begin this story. Not the kind of stillness that is empty, but one that seems to listen back. In that quiet space between waking and sleep, history softens its sharp edges. Names become whispers, battles become distant echoes, and a life that once shook the ancient world begins, not with conquest, but with breath. Let me tell you about a child born into expectation, into tension, into a world already waiting for him to become something more than human. Long before the world knew his name, Macedonia was a land of hard soil and harder people. It sat at the edge of the Greek world, close enough to be influenced, far enough to be mistrusted. Villages were shaped by mountains and seasons, by the slow rhythm of farming and the sudden violence of war. Horses were valued as much as men. Strength was admired, but lineage mattered just as deeply. This was a place where survival was learned early and ambition was never quiet. The people of this land believed deeply in signs and omens. The gods were not distant ideas, they were present forces, felt in storms, dreams, and unexpected turns of fate. Births, especially royal ones, were watched closely. A child's arrival was not just a family event, but a message to be interpreted. Was the child favored? Was he cursed? Or was he meant to carry something larger than himself into the future? Into this world, Alexander was born in the summer of 356 BCE. Even his birth was wrapped in stories. It was said that the night before, his mother dreamed of thunder and fire. Others whispered that the great temple of Artemis burned on the very day he entered the world, as if the gods themselves were distracted by a more important arrival. These stories would grow over time, retold and reshaped, but they mattered because people believed them. From the very beginning, Alexander's life was surrounded by meaning before he ever made a choice of his own. As a child, Alexander did not grow up in quiet safety. The Macedonian court was a place of constant tension, filled with rivalries, shifting loyalties, and unspoken threats. Power was never secure. Kings were admired, but they were also watched, judged, and sometimes removed. Alexander learned early that love and danger could exist in the same room, sometimes in the same person. Trust was a fragile thing. Even in his youth, those around him sensed something restless. He listened intently, but rarely accepted limits. When others obeyed, he questioned. When others feared consequences, he seemed to look past them, towards something only he could see. His courage was noticed, but so was his pride. It was not yet the pride of a conqueror, but the quiet certainty of a boy who felt the world should eventually make space for him. As he grew, stories of heroes filled his imagination. Tales of Achilles, of gods walking among men, of glory earned through suffering and courage. These were not bedtime stories meant to soothe, they were lessons. They taught him that a short life remembered forever could be worth more than a long one forgotten. Somewhere in these stories, something settled deep within him, shaping how he would later see fear, pain, and death. The presence of power was constant in Alexander's life. His father was king, his mother fiercely protective, and the weight of expectation never lifted. He learned to ride, to fight, to speak with confidence long before most children understood themselves. Yet, beneath the training and ceremony, there was also isolation. To be born into greatness is to be separated from ordinary life. Even as a child, Alexander stood slightly apart, watched more closely, praised more carefully, and corrected more harshly. Slowly, almost quietly, the boy began to change. Ambition took form. Curiosity deepened into hunger. He did not merely want to inherit a throne, he wanted to prove something, to himself, to his parents, to the unseen forces he believed were guiding him. The world as it existed felt too small, and though no one could yet imagine how far he would go, the direction was already set. As this first chapter draws to a close, nothing has been conquered yet, No armies have marched, no cities have fallen, and yet something important has already happened. A life has begun under the weight of myth, expectation, and belief. The quiet before the storm has settled, and as the night deepens, the story moves forward, carrying us gently toward the forces that would shape this child into Alexander of Macedon. The story continues in the slow rhythm of the Macedonian court, where mornings began with the sound of horses and evenings ended with guarded conversations spoken in low voices. As Alexander grew, the world around him sharpened its focus. Childhood was not something to linger in for long. In this place, boys were expected to become men quickly, and princes even faster. Every step he took was measured against what he might one day become. Philip II ruled Macedonia with a presence that filled every space he entered. He was a man shaped by war, marked by scars, and hardened by survival. One eye lost in battle, his body bore the memory of countless campaigns. To his people, he was strength made visible. To his enemies, he was relentless. Philip did not rule through gentleness. He ruled by reshaping the very idea of what Macedonia could be, transforming it from a fractured kingdom into a rising power. Life under Philip's reign was disciplined and practical. The court was not a place of luxury alone, but of constant preparation. Soldiers trained year-round, weapons were refined, alliances were negotiated with calculation rather than sentiment. Even celebrations carried an undercurrent of strategy. Alexander watched all of this closely. He learned that power was not only about courage on the battlefield, but about patience, planning, and knowing when to strike. The values Philip lived by were clear. Strength was respected, weakness was exploited, loyalty was rewarded but never assumed. These beliefs shaped the environment in which Alexander was raised. He learned that fear could be a tool, but only if controlled. He learned that leadership required decisiveness, even when it caused pain. In this world, hesitation was dangerous. Yet beneath Philip's confidence lay constant tension. His court was filled with rival wives, political marriages, and shifting alliances. Each union brought new possibilities and new threats. Alexander was not blind to this instability. He saw how quickly favor could change, how easily trust could fracture. The lessons were not spoken aloud, but they were absorbed all the same. As Alexander grew older, his relationship with his father became more complex. Philip admired strength and courage, and Alexander possessed both. But admiration did not always come easily. Philip was a towering figure, and standing in his shadow was unavoidable. Praise was rare, criticism direct. Alexander felt the need not only to succeed, but to surpass, to be seen not as an extension of his father, but as something distinct. Moments of pride were often followed by moments of distance. Philip's absences on campaign left Alexander with stories rather than presence. Victories returned as celebrations, but also reminders of expectations yet to be fulfilled. Alexander listened to accounts of battles with intense focus, memorizing details, imagining himself there. The battlefield became familiar to him long before he ever set foot on one. There were times when admiration turned into quiet rivalry. Alexander absorbed his father's achievements, but also measured them. He noticed where Philip relied on others, where compromise softened victory. These observations were not criticisms spoken aloud, but thoughts held closely, shaping his own emerging sense of leadership. As tension grew within the royal family, Alexander learned that power could divide as much as it united. Disputes between Philip and Olympias spilled into the atmosphere of the court, creating emotional fractures that Alexander could not escape.
Love, authority, resentment, and ambition tangled together, forming a complicated emotional landscape. Through it all, Philip remained the central force. His reforms of the army, his expansion of influence, his unyielding drive laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Alexander inherited not just a throne, but a machine already in motion. The question was never whether he would rule, but how. As the days passed and the boy grew closer to manhood, the shape of his future became clearer. He was being prepared, whether gently or harshly, for a world that demanded strength above all else. And as the night settles deeper around this story, the presence of Philip II remains, unyielding, instructive, and impossible to ignore, guiding us quietly toward the forces that would shape Alexander's inner fire.
The nights of the Macedonian palace were rarely silent. Even when the halls grew dark and the torches burned low, there was always a sense of movement beneath the stillness. Whispers traveled through stone corridors. Emotions lingered long after voices faded. It was in this atmosphere that Olympias moved, quietly, deliberately, leaving impressions that would last far longer than any spoken command. Olympias came from Epirus, a land steeped in ancient rituals and old beliefs. The people there held the gods close, not as distant rulers of the sky, but as living presences woven into daily life. Snakes were sacred, dreams were messages, and divine forces were believed to speak through signs that only the attentive could understand. Olympias carried this worldview with her into the Macedonian court, where it both fascinated and unsettled those around her. To Alexander, his mother was not merely a queen. She was a source of certainty in a world that often felt unstable. Where Philip taught strategy and strength, Olympias taught meaning. She spoke of destiny as if it were a companion, walking just ahead, waiting to be caught. She did not tell her son that greatness was possible. She spoke as though it were inevitable. From an early age, Alexander was surrounded by stories that blurred the line between myth and reality. Olympias encouraged these stories, nurturing a sense that her son was marked by something extraordinary. She spoke of his birth as a moment the gods had noticed. She hinted that his blood carried more than human ambition. Whether she believed these things fully or used them as protection in a dangerous court mattered little. The effect on Alexander was profound. The court, however, did not always welcome Olympias's influence. Her intensity, her devotion to ancient rites, and her refusal to soften herself made her both powerful and isolated. Political tensions between her and Philip deepened over time, creating an emotional divide that Alexander was forced to navigate. In these moments, loyalty was not a simple choice, it was a survival instinct. As disputes grew more frequent, Alexander watched how his mother endured them. She did not retreat, she did not forget. Olympias understood power not as something given, but as something defended relentlessly. From her, Alexander learned that memory could be a weapon and that patience could be sharper than any blade. The beliefs Olympias passed to her son shaped how he understood fear and fate. Danger was not something to avoid, but something to face with the confidence of divine favor. If the gods were watching, then retreat felt like betrayal. This belief would later give Alexander remarkable courage, but it would also push him toward risks others would not dare to take. There were moments of tenderness between mother and son, moments untouched by politics. Quiet conversations, shared glances, reassurance offered without words. Yet even these moments carried weight. Love, in this context, was inseparable from expectation. Olympias did not simply love Alexander as a child, she believed in him as a symbol. As Alexander matured, the voice of his mother remained constant within him. It was not loud, but persistent.
It reminded him that he was meant for more, that hesitation was a form of forgetting who he was. In moments of doubt, it would rise again, urging him forward. The influence of Olympias was not gentle, but it was shaping. It instilled in Alexander a sense of destiny that could not be easily undone. As the night deepens and this chapter closes, we are left with the image of a young man carrying not only the lessons of his father, but the fire of belief passed down by his mother, a fire that would soon seek a world large enough to contain it.
As Alexander moved closer to manhood, the world around him began to slow in a different way. Not quieter, but more deliberate. This was the season when questions replaced certainty, when raw energy needed direction. The Macedonian court, aware of what rested in the young prince's future, turned its attention not only to his strength, but to his mind. It was time for guidance that reached beyond the sword. Aristotle arrived not as a conqueror, but as a presence that reshaped space through thought alone. He came from the world of ideas, carrying with him a calm authority earned through observation and reason. Where others spoke of destiny and divine favor, Aristotle spoke of cause and consequence. He did not dismiss the gods, but he placed humanity firmly at the center of inquiry. For Alexander, this was a new kind of power. Lessons unfolded slowly, often outdoors, surrounded by nature rather than walls. Philosophy, science, politics, and poetry flowed together, not as separate subjects, but as parts of a single understanding of the world. Aristotle taught Alexander to observe before acting, to question before believing. He introduced the idea that greatness was not only measured by conquest, but by the ability to understand and govern wisely. The values Aristotle offered were rooted in balance. Excess, he warned, could destroy even the strongest. Virtue lay in moderation, in knowing one's limits. For a young man raised on stories of heroes and divine favor, these lessons introduced quiet tension. Alexander listened, absorbed, and respected his teacher deeply, but not without resistance. His nature leaned toward extremes, toward reaching beyond what seemed reasonable. As knowledge expanded, so did awareness. Alexander learned of other cultures, other forms of governance, other ways of life. The world became larger, more complex. With that complexity came unease. If greatness required wisdom, then ignorance became a threat. The weight of responsibility began to settle more heavily upon him. There were moments when philosophy clashed with ambition. Aristotle spoke of order and restraint, while Alexander imagined movement and expansion. These differences were never hostile, but they were real. In them, Alexander began to form his own synthesis, a belief that knowledge should serve action and action should shape the world. Human emotion played its role as well. Pride grew alongside learning. Alexander did not see education as a way to humble himself, but as a tool to sharpen his purpose. Each lesson felt like preparation, not contemplation. He was learning how to think, but always with an eye toward what thinking would allow him to do. Over time, the teachings left their mark. Alexander's speech grew more measured, his curiosity widened. He developed a deep appreciation for literature and history, especially stories of great men who had shaped their worlds. These stories no longer felt distant, they felt like mirrors. Change followed quietly. The boy who once absorbed lessons without question now filtered them through his own emerging vision. Aristotle had given him structure, but the direction remained his own. Knowledge did not slow his ambition, it refined it. As this chapter fades, we are left with a young man standing at the intersection of thought and action. Philosophy has entered his life, not to replace fire with calm, but to give that fire shape. The night holds steady, and the story moves forward, carrying Alexander toward the moment when learning must give way to decision and preparation to fate. The passage into adulthood rarely arrives all at once. It moves quietly, marked by moments that seem small at the time, yet carry lasting weight. For Alexander, this transition unfolded under constant observation. Every gesture, every word, every reaction was watched and remembered. The court no longer saw a child in training, but a presence forming, one that would soon be tested. From an early age, Alexander's character revealed itself in subtle ways. He was intensely focused, often withdrawing into thought when others sought distraction. When challenges arose, he did not hesitate long. There was a steadiness in his gaze that unsettled some and inspired others. Courage came naturally to him, but it was paired with a deep sensitivity to honor and respect. Insults, even unintended ones, lingered in his mind. Ambition was not hidden. It lived openly in his speech and posture. Alexander did not dream quietly. He spoke of greatness as though it were a responsibility rather than a desire. Yet alongside this confidence was an ego that demanded recognition. Praise fueled him, but criticism cut deeply. These emotional extremes shaped how he responded to pressure, pushing him toward boldness when caution might have served better. One of the most telling moments of his youth came with the taming of Bucephalus. The horse was powerful, untamed, and feared by many. Where others saw danger, Alexander saw understanding. He noticed the animal's fear of its own shadow and approached with patience rather than force. The act became legend, not because it displayed strength, but because it revealed perception. It showed a young man who believed no challenge was beyond him if approached correctly. This belief, however, carried risk. Success reinforced the idea that obstacles existed to be overcome, not respected. Alexander learned early that boldness could be rewarded, and this lesson stayed with him. It shaped his confidence and his willingness to act where others hesitated. Emotionally, Alexander was intense. Joy, anger, pride, and disappointment all surfaced fully. He did not hide what he felt, nor did he easily let go of grievances. Loyalty mattered deeply to him, and betrayal was remembered. These traits would later bind men to him with fierce devotion, but they would also create moments of conflict and regret. As expectations grew, so did pressure. Alexander was constantly compared to his father, to heroes of old, to imagined futures. Each comparison sharpened his sense of urgency. Time felt limited. He began to see his life not as a long journey, but as a narrow path that demanded swift movement. Change followed these realizations. Alexander's presence became more commanding. His words carried confidence that bordered on challenge. Those around him began to adjust, sensing that the balance was shifting. He was no longer simply being prepared for power. He was reaching for it. As the night deepens, this chapter closes with a young man standing on the edge of transformation. His ambition is no longer theoretical. His courage has been tested, his ego shaped, his vision sharpened. The calm before authority is fading, and the world around him is beginning to respond. The moment of transition arrived not with ceremony, but with shock. News traveled quickly, carried by anxious voices and uncertain glances. Philip II was dead, struck down during a public celebration meant to display unity and strength. The court that had once revolved around his presence suddenly felt exposed, as if the walls themselves were unsure whom they now served. In the quiet after violence, a new reality began to take shape. Alexander was only 20 years old. To some, he was too young, too untested, too shaped by ideals rather than experience. The throne he inherited was powerful, but fragile. Enemies watched closely, both within Macedonia and beyond its borders. Old rivals sensed opportunity. Former allies measured their chances. The world did not pause to mourn. It waited to see whether the son could carry the weight of the father. The days that followed were filled with careful movement. Alexander acted quickly, not out of panic, but with deliberate urgency. He secured the loyalty of the army first, understanding that power without soldiers was an illusion. He addressed them not as a boy seeking approval, but as a leader assuming responsibility. His words were calm, his posture steady. The response was immediate. Loyalty settled, not because it was forced, but because it was recognized. Beliefs shaped his choices in these early moments. Alexander had been taught that hesitation invited chaos. He believed order had to be established before it could be challenged. Mercy had its place, but strength had to be shown first. These assumptions guided his actions as whispers of rebellion reached his ears. In Greece, old tensions resurfaced. City-states that had bowed to Philip began to question their submission. The idea of Macedonian dominance suddenly felt less certain. Athens stirred. Thebes grew restless. Hope and fear moved together through the region. The question was simple, yet heavy with consequence. Would Alexander be tested or ignored? He did not wait for the answer to come to him. Alexander moved south with speed that surprised even his supporters. His presence alone unsettled resistance. He spoke when necessary, negotiated when useful, and acted when challenged. The message was clear without being shouted. Macedonia was still watching, still capable, still unified. When Thebes chose defiance, the response was swift and unforgiving. The city fell, and its destruction echoed far beyond its walls. It was a moment that revealed both Alexander's resolve and his capacity for severity. The choice was not made lightly, but it was made without hesitation. Fear spread, and rebellion quieted. Human reactions followed naturally. Some were shocked, others were relieved, many were silent. Alexander himself did not celebrate. He understood what had been lost as well as what had been secured. Yet the decision stood. Order had been restored, and the cost was now part of his rule. With Greece subdued, the young king stood alone in the stillness that followed decisive action. The crown was no longer symbolic, it was real, heavy, and unmistakably his. He had crossed a threshold from preparation into consequence. As the night deepens, this chapter closes with a ruler newly formed by choice and loss. Alexander has taken his first steps not as a prince, but as a king. The world has begun to respond, and the path ahead stretches outward, quiet for now, but already charged with what is to come. The calm that followed was deceptive. Beneath the surface of stability, movement continued, quiet and deliberate. Alexander understood that authority once established must be maintained through presence, not distance. Peace, in his world, was never something that simply existed. It had to be carried forward, reinforced by action and readiness. The night did not fully settle, it hovered, watchful. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned his attention to the instrument that would define his reign, the army. This force was not new. It had been shaped carefully under Philip II, refined through years of reform and discipline, yet now it belonged to a different kind of leader. Alexander did not see soldiers as pieces on a board. He saw them as an extension of his own will, bound to him by trust, shared hardship, and visibility. Daily life within the camp followed a rhythm both demanding and intimate. Training was constant, but so was conversation. Alexander walked among his men, learned their names, listened to their concerns. He ate what they ate, endured what they endured. This closeness was not accidental. It built loyalty that no decree could command. The army did not merely follow him, it believed in him. The values guiding this force were rooted in discipline and innovation. The Macedonian phalanx stood at its center, a formation designed not for chaos, but for cohesion.
Long spears moved as one, shields locked together, each man dependent on the next. It was a living structure, demanding trust and precision. Alexander understood its power deeply, but he also understood its limits. Where others relied strictly on tradition, Alexander encouraged adaptation. Cavalry moved with greater freedom, flanking maneuvers became more fluid, speed and surprise were elevated alongside strength. These changes were not abrupt, but gradual, shaped by observation and experience. Alexander did not seek to replace what worked, he sought to sharpen it. There was tension in this evolution. Innovation always unsettles those comfortable with established methods. Some veterans questioned the risks, others feared overreach. Alexander listened, weighed concerns, and decided. His authority rested not in stubbornness, but in conviction. When he chose a path, he committed fully. Emotion played its role here as well. Alexander felt a deep connection to those who fought beside him. Victory was shared. Loss was personal. Each fallen soldier mattered, not as a number, but as a presence now absent. This awareness strengthened his resolve, but also deepened his sense of responsibility. As preparations continued, a larger purpose began to emerge. The army was not being refined for defense alone. It was being shaped for movement beyond familiar borders. The idea of expansion, once distant, now felt tangible. Plans whispered among officers. Maps were studied more closely. The horizon widened. In quiet moments, Alexander reflected on what he was building. An army could conquer land, but it could also carry ideas, values, and change. Whether this change would be welcomed or resisted was unknown. What mattered was readiness. The structure was forming. The momentum was building. As this chapter fades into the night, the image that remains is one of alignment, leader and army, vision and preparation, trust and discipline, all moving together. The path ahead is still dark, but it is no longer uncertain. The world beyond Greece awaits, and Alexander is learning how to meet it.
Beyond the familiar hills and coastlines of Greece, the world stretched wide and unfamiliar. To many, it was a place of stories rather than experience, known through merchants' tales and half-remembered legends. To Alexander, it was a space of possibility. The calm before departure carried a weight unlike any other, filled with anticipation and unspoken resolve. Preparation for what lay ahead was careful and deliberate. Supplies were gathered, routes considered, alliances tested. Nothing was rushed, yet nothing was delayed without reason. Alexander understood that crossing into Asia was not merely a military decision, it was a statement. It marked a shift from regional power to something larger, something uncertain. The men felt it, even if they did not speak of it openly. Belief played a quiet role in this moment. Many saw the campaign as a continuation of old grievances, a response to past invasions, a settling of historical balance. Others viewed it as destiny unfolding. Alexander allowed these interpretations to exist side by side. He did not define the meaning for his army. He let each man carry his own reason forward. As the forces moved toward the Hellespont, the boundary between worlds, the atmosphere changed. This narrow stretch of water had been crossed before by heroes and kings. Standing there, Alexander felt the weight of those stories press gently against the present. The crossing was symbolic, but symbols mattered. They shaped memory, and memory shaped loyalty. When Alexander stepped onto Asian soil, there was no grand announcement, no dramatic pause, only quiet acknowledgement of what had begun. The land did not resist immediately. It waited. Villages carried on with their daily rhythms, uncertain of what approach meant. Life for now remained unchanged. Yet tension was present, moving just beneath the surface. The Persian Empire, vast and powerful, did not yet feel threatened by a young king from the west. Distance created a sense of safety. Alexander understood this, and he did not rush to shatter it. Patience, he had learned, could be as effective as force. Human reactions followed familiar patterns. Some felt fear, others excitement. Many felt both. Alexander observed these responses closely, adjusting his leadership to the moment. Confidence was offered where doubt arose. Restraint was shown where aggression would have caused harm. Each choice reinforced trust. As the army settled into foreign territory, adaptation began. New customs were observed, new landscapes navigated. The familiar patterns of camp life adjusted slowly to unfamiliar conditions. Change did not come as a shock, but as a gradual shift. In reflection, Alexander sensed the scale of what he had initiated. This was no longer about proving himself to Greece or securing his father's legacy. The path now led into the unknown, where victories would be measured differently and consequences would travel farther. As this chapter closes, the night feels wider, stretched across unfamiliar ground. The first step into Asia has been taken, quietly but irrevocably. The journey forward continues, and with it, the unfolding of a story that will reach far beyond anything imagined before. The first true test did not announce itself with spectacle. It emerged gradually, like a distant pressure felt before a storm. The land seemed calm, but the presence of opposing forces lingered just beyond sight. Alexander understood that the beginning of a campaign often carried the most uncertainty. Before momentum formed, before confidence hardened, everything remained delicate. Along the banks of the Granicus River, two worlds edged closer to collision. Persian forces gathered with confidence shaped by tradition and scale. They had faced many challengers before, and this one appeared young, distant, and unfamiliar. The river itself flowed quietly, indifferent to what men intended to decide upon its banks. Nature, as always, remained unchanged. Beliefs guided both sides in subtle ways. The Persians trusted in their numbers and position. The Macedonians trusted in cohesion and leadership. Alexander trusted in timing. He studied the terrain, listened to counsel, and weighed risk against opportunity. The moment did not demand caution alone. It demanded resolve. When the decision came, it was swift. Alexander chose to engage directly, crossing the river under pressure. The act itself carried symbolic weight. It signaled intent without hesitation. Soldiers followed, not because the crossing was easy, but because their leader was already moving. Courage in that instant became contagious. The conflict unfolded with intensity, but not chaos. The Macedonian formations held, adapted, and pressed forward. Cavalry surged where openings appeared. Alexander was visible throughout, not commanding from distance, but sharing risk. This presence mattered. It anchored morale and sharpened focus. Human reactions surfaced quickly. Fear appeared, then was overcome. Injury brought pain, then endurance. Loss was felt immediately, yet did not halt momentum. The river, once a barrier, became a passage. When the fighting ended, the outcome was clear. The Persian line had broken. The path forward lay open. Reflection followed victory. Alexander did not treat the moment lightly. He honored the fallen, tended to the wounded, and considered what had been proven. This was more than a tactical success. It was confirmation. The army could face the empire and prevail. Change began to ripple outward. Cities nearby responded with caution or surrender. Resistance softened. The idea of invincibility shifted. Alexander did not push recklessly. He allowed news to travel, letting the meaning of the encounter settle into the broader landscape. In quieter moments, Alexander considered the weight of leadership. Each decision carried lives with it. Victory brought confidence, but also responsibility. The path ahead was still long, and this was only the beginning. As this chapter fades into the night, the river recedes into memory. The first great confrontation has passed, leaving behind certainty shaped by experience. The world has taken notice, and the journey continues forward, deeper into the heart of an empire now aware that it is being approached. Momentum, once awakened, has a way of carrying everything with it. After the first great confrontation, the campaign moved forward with a steady, deliberate rhythm. Victory did not erupt into chaos or celebration. It settled quietly, becoming part of the journey rather than its climax. Alexander understood that restraint now would shape what came next. The lands of Asia Minor unfolded gradually, revealing cities shaped by trade, belief, and long histories of adaptation. Life continued within their walls, measured by markets and rituals rather than armies. To these places, Alexander arrived not as a distant rumor, but as a presence that demanded response. Some cities opened their gates, others waited, uncertain of his intent. Belief systems shifted with proximity. Those who had trusted in Persian authority now weighed alternatives. Alexander did not force loyalty where it could be earned. He presented himself as a liberator as much as a conqueror, restoring local customs and honoring temples. This approach was deliberate. It softened resistance and reframed his advance. Tension, however, never disappeared. Beneath gestures of respect lay the reality of power. Garrisons were placed, order was maintained, mercy was offered, but boundaries were clear. Alexander balanced firmness with adaptability, adjusting his methods to each situation without losing direction. Human responses varied widely. Some welcomed change, others mourned the passing of familiar rule. Alexander observed these reactions with increasing awareness. He began to understand that conquest was not only a matter of defeating armies, but of managing emotion, memory, and expectation. As the campaign progressed, confidence deepened. The army moved with greater cohesion, shaped by shared experience. Trust between leader and soldiers strengthened further. Each success reinforced belief, not only in strategy, but in purpose. Reflection followed progress. Alexander considered the scale of what was unfolding. He was no longer reacting to threats or testing strength. He was shaping the course of regions, influencing lives far removed from his own origins. The weight of this realization did not slow him, but it sharpened his focus. Change became visible in Alexander himself. His leadership grew more measured. Decisions reflected broader consideration. The lessons of philosophy, ambition, and belief converged in practice. He was becoming something different than the boy who first crossed into Asia. As the night draws this chapter to a close, the sense of movement remains gentle but persistent. The path ahead leads toward greater challenges and deeper questions. The journey continues, carrying us forward into encounters that will test not only strength, but identity and vision. The journey inward continued without triumphal noise. Victory had opened doors, but it had also deepened silence. As the army moved through lands once firmly held by Persia, the world did not collapse, it adjusted. Markets reopened, fields were tended, people watched from a distance, uncertain but observant. Change, Alexander was learning, rarely arrived all at once. Life along the march settled into a new familiarity. Persian roads stretched farther than any Macedonian path before them, carefully built, deliberately maintained. Cities appeared with walls worn smooth by time rather than war. These places had their own rhythms, their own memories. Alexander allowed life to continue where possible. Stability, he believed, could serve conquest better than fear alone. Belief systems now intertwined. Macedonian gods traveled beside Persian rituals. Altars differed, prayers sounded unfamiliar, yet meaning was shared. People everywhere sought protection, order, and continuity. Alexander observed this closely. He began to understand that ruling land was not the same as ruling people. Influence required recognition, not just authority. Unease returned as resistance shifted form. Open battle gave way to distance and delay. Loyalty was uncertain. Trust had to be earned repeatedly. Alexander felt the weight of leadership grow heavier, not through danger alone, but through responsibility. Each city spared became a promise. Each promise carried consequence. As pressure accumulated, Alexander's choices grew more complex. He was no longer simply advancing. He was deciding what kind of ruler he would become. Severity had secured obedience. Restraint now tested legitimacy. The balance between fear and acceptance demanded constant attention. Human responses followed these shifts. Some officers welcomed the broader vision. Others worried that softness invited weakness. Conversations grew quieter, more careful. Alexander listened, but the path he envisioned was forming clearly within him. He did not seek to destroy Persia. He sought to replace its center. Change appeared gradually in his behavior. He adopted elements of Persian custom, not as imitation, but as acknowledgement. Dress, ceremony, and court practices shifted subtly. These decisions unsettled some, intrigued others. They signaled a future that did not belong entirely to one world or another. Reflection deepened in moments of rest. Alexander thought often of limits, of land, of endurance, of identity. Expansion no longer felt like momentum alone. It felt like responsibility unfolding faster than answers could keep pace. Yet stopping seemed impossible. The movement itself had become part of who he was. Patterns emerged in quiet clarity. Conquest altered both the conquered and the conqueror. To move forward unchanged was an illusion. Alexander was becoming something new, shaped by each choice, each compromise, each adaptation. The boy of Macedon felt distant now, though not forgotten. As this chapter eases into stillness, the night feels broader and more complex. The world is no longer divided simply between home and foreign soil. It is becoming something shared, uncertain, and unfinished. The journey continues, drawing Alexander further into the heart of his own transformation, where the next horizon waits without certainty, but not without meaning. The road ahead no longer felt like a straight line. It curved inward, folding past and present together. As Alexander moved deeper into Persia, the distance from Macedonia became more than geographic. Familiar customs faded into memory, replaced by new patterns of life and rule. The night carried a quieter tension now, one shaped less by immediate threat and more by transformation. Daily life within the expanding empire required careful balance. Administration followed conquest, and order had to be maintained without constant force. Alexander learned to rely on local officials, adapting systems rather than erasing them. This choice slowed movement but strengthened control. Power, he was discovering, could be sustained through continuity as much as command. Beliefs shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. Alexander no longer stood only as a Macedonian king leading foreign troops. To many, he began to resemble a ruler shaped by multiple worlds. This perception mattered. It altered how cities received him, how leaders spoke in his presence, how resistance was measured and expressed. Unease grew among some of his closest companions. The adoption of Persian customs, once symbolic, now touched daily ritual. Court ceremonies lengthened, gestures of respect changed form. These shifts, though measured, created distance. What felt like unity to Alexander felt like loss to others. Pressure accumulated within relationships. Old bonds forged in shared hardship were tested by unfamiliar expectations. Alexander sensed this strain, yet felt unable to retreat. The path he walked demanded adaptation. To stop changing felt like standing still, and stillness carried its own dangers. Human reactions varied. Some followed willingly, curious and adaptable. Others complied quietly, their loyalty strained but intact. A few resisted openly, interpreting change as betrayal. Alexander responded with a mixture of patience and firmness, unwilling to fracture the foundation he had built, yet unwilling to abandon his vision. Reflection deepened during moments of solitude. Alexander questioned how far a leader could bend before losing himself. Identity, once clear, now felt layered and shifting. The certainty of youth gave way to contemplation shaped by consequence. Each decision echoed longer than expected. Change, once driven by ambition, now felt shaped by necessity. The empire demanded cohesion beyond force. Alexander's role expanded from conqueror to unifier, from commander to symbol. This transformation did not come with clarity or comfort. It unfolded slowly, unevenly. Patterns emerged across cultures and time. Power required recognition. Authority needed meaning. Conquest without integration faded quickly. Alexander sensed these truths forming beneath his actions, guiding him even when certainty remained distant. As this chapter settles into quiet, the night feels reflective rather than restless. The journey continues, not only across land, but inward. Alexander moves forward carrying questions as much as answers, shaped by the world he is reshaping, stepping steadily toward a future that grows more complex with every passing mile. As the empire stretched wider, the rhythm of movement slowed, not from hesitation, but from accumulation. Each victory added weight of territory, of people, of expectation. The night now carried a sense of density, as though the air itself held memory. Alexander felt this change even in moments of rest, when silence no longer felt empty, but full. Life among the army evolved. The familiar bond between leader and soldier remained, but it was tested by distance and scale. Alexander could no longer know every face, every story. Trust, once personal, became structural. Command passed through layers, responsibility spread outward, and with it, uncertainty. Beliefs that once united the army began to diverge. For some, the campaign remained a shared dream of glory and reward. For others, it became a burden measured in years away from home. The idea of return, once distant, now surfaced in conversation. Alexander listened, but the horizon still pulled him forward. Unease surfaced in moments of conflict between vision and fatigue. The men had followed him across seas and empires, but limits approached quietly. Alexander sensed resistance not as rebellion, but as weariness. This realization carried its own weight. Leadership, he understood, required not only inspiration, but empathy. Pressure increased within the command structure. Decisions now affected more than momentum. They shaped morale. Alexander weighed each step carefully, knowing that confidence could erode without visible purpose. Yet his own sense of direction remained strong, guided by an inner certainty difficult to share. Human reactions reflected this divide. Loyalty persisted, but it became quieter, less celebratory. Obedience replaced enthusiasm. Alexander responded by reaffirming his presence, sharing hardship where possible, reminding his men of shared history rather than promised reward. Reflection deepened into questioning. Alexander wondered whether greatness demanded endless movement or whether it required knowing when to stop. The answer did not come easily. The path forward still appeared clearer than the thought of turning back. Motion felt safer than pause. Change emerged in subtle leadership shifts. Alexander delegated more, trusted selectively, and enforced discipline with greater consistency. Emotional intensity remained, but it was tempered by experience. The fire of youth had not gone out, but it burned more steadily. Patterns across the campaign revealed themselves. Expansion created distance. Distance tested loyalty. Loyalty required renewal. Alexander recognized these cycles, though mastering them proved elusive. Control could be asserted, but unity had to be earned again and again. As this chapter eases into stillness, the night feels heavy but calm. The empire stands vast, the army loyal yet tired, the leader determined yet reflective. The journey continues, now shaped as much by human limits as by ambition, moving steadily toward moments that will test not strength alone, but endurance and restraint. The farther the army traveled, the more the landscape resisted familiarity. Mountains rose where maps grew uncertain, and roads dissolved into paths shaped by time rather than design. The night air felt thinner here, carrying sounds that did not echo as expected. Alexander moved forward into regions where control was no longer asserted by presence alone, but tested by persistence. Daily life became harder, stripped of earlier comforts. Supplies were stretched, communication slowed. The men adapted as they always had, but the cost was visible in their posture and silence. Alexander shared these conditions, refusing distance even when it would have eased his own burden. Leadership, to him, still meant exposure. Beliefs were tested by exhaustion. Destiny, once a powerful force, felt distant in moments of hunger and cold. Faith did not disappear, but it quieted. Practical concerns replaced grand visions in many minds. Survival became a daily achievement rather than a given. Unease deepened as resistance took unfamiliar forms. There were no grand armies to defeat, no clear lines to break. Instead, there was distance, terrain, and time. The enemy was not always visible. Progress slowed, and with it, certainty. Alexander sensed frustration growing, both around him and within himself. Pressure mounted as choices narrowed. Retreat would preserve lives but fracture purpose. Advance risked endurance itself. Alexander considered each path carefully, aware that the margin for error had thinned. His decisions now balanced ambition against responsibility more delicately than ever before. Human reactions surfaced sharply. Some followed with quiet resolve. Others questioned silently. A few spoke openly, their loyalty strained but not broken. Alexander listened, responded, and acted. His authority remained, but it now carried the weight of consequence more heavily than triumph. Reflection followed moments of solitude. Alexander thought of how far he had come and how far he stood from anything once familiar. The world he carried within him felt vast and unsettled. He questioned whether conquest had an end or whether it reshaped those who pursued it until stopping no longer felt possible. Change appeared in his leadership. Discipline tightened. Expectations grew clearer. Emotional expression became more controlled, not absent but measured. Experience had sharpened him, even as it wearied him. The fire remained, but it was tempered by necessity. Patterns across the campaign became undeniable. Expansion demanded adaptation. Adaptation required sacrifice. Sacrifice altered identity. Alexander understood this progression intuitively now. Each step forward carried unseen costs that could not be recovered. As this chapter settles into quiet, the night feels remote and vast. The journey presses onward through land that resists memory and meaning alike. Alexander continues, not driven by impulse alone, but by a resolve shaped through endurance, carrying both the weight of empire and the quiet strain of what it takes to hold it together. The approach toward the eastern edges of the known world carried a different kind of stillness. It was not the quiet of anticipation, but of accumulation, of miles traveled, decisions made, and limits slowly revealed. The night no longer felt endless. It felt close, pressing gently against those who moved beneath it. Alexander sensed this change even as he continued forward. Daily routines grew heavier, the marches lengthened, and rest came less easily. The land demanded more than it offered. Rivers were crossed with caution, forests navigated with patience, and unfamiliar climates tested endurance. The army adapted as it always had, but adaptation now required deeper effort. Each day asked more than the last. Beliefs shifted again under strain. For many, the idea of destiny felt quieter, almost distant. Faith remained, but it no longer burned brightly. Instead, it steadied itself into persistence. Alexander noticed this change and understood it. Grandeur had given way to survival, and survival carried its own form of courage. Unease surfaced as the distance from home became nearly immeasurable. Macedonia felt like another lifetime. The thought of return, once abstract, now felt uncertain. Some wondered if return was still part of the story at all. Alexander carried these unspoken questions with him, aware that silence often held more truth than speech. Pressure gathered around decisions that could no longer be delayed. The land ahead promised no clear reward, only continuation. Advancement no longer meant conquest in familiar terms. It meant testing the edge of endurance itself. Alexander weighed this reality carefully, knowing that leadership now required restraint as much as resolve. Human reactions reflected exhaustion and loyalty intertwined. There was frustration, but also deep commitment. The men had come too far to abandon the journey lightly. Alexander responded by remaining present, sharing hardship, reinforcing purpose through connection rather than command. Reflection deepened into quiet confrontation. Alexander questioned the nature of limits, whether they were boundaries to respect or challenges to overcome. The answer was no longer obvious. The fire that once urged him forward now shared space with caution shaped by experience. Change appeared subtly in his decisions. He listened more closely. He delayed when necessary. Authority remained firm, but it was no longer urgent for affirmation. Leadership had matured, shaped by distance, fatigue, and consequence. Patterns emerged with clarity. Ambition propelled movement. Movement demanded sacrifice. Sacrifice altered vision. Alexander recognized this cycle within himself and within those who followed him. The journey was no longer about proving possibility. It was about understanding cost. As this chapter eases into stillness, the night feels reflective, almost intimate. The world ahead remains vast, but the meaning of forward motion has changed. Alexander continues, not as the boy driven by myth, nor solely as the conqueror of empires, but as a leader navigating the quiet truth that even greatness must one day reckon with its limits. The return from the farthest reaches did not feel like retreat. It felt like release mixed with uncertainty. The path turned back upon itself, carrying with it the weight of what had been reached and what had been refused. The night seemed softer now, as though the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Alexander moved forward, but with a different awareness shaping each step. Daily life shifted again as familiar rhythms slowly reappeared. Roads widened, settlements felt closer together, supplies became more reliable. Yet comfort did not fully return. The journey had altered perception. What once felt familiar now seemed distant, reshaped by experience. The army carried itself differently, marked by endurance rather than anticipation. Beliefs continued to evolve. The certainty of destiny had softened into reflection. Victory was no longer imagined as endless expansion, but as survival, cohesion, and return. Alexander sensed this shift and allowed it to exist. Meaning, he understood, could change without losing its power. Unease emerged in new forms. The challenges ahead were no longer external alone. They lived within relationships, within expectations, within the growing complexity of rule. Alexander now governed not only through movement, but through presence across a vast and diverse empire. Control demanded attention in ways conquest never had. Pressure accumulated around identity. Alexander had become many things to many people: king, conqueror, unifier, symbol. Holding these roles together required constant adjustment. Each choice risked misunderstanding. Each gesture carried interpretation beyond intent. Human reactions reflected this tension. Companions who had shared early victories now navigated unfamiliar distance. Loyalty remained, but it was no longer simple. Alexander responded with effort, seeking connection while maintaining authority. Balance became the quiet challenge of every day. Reflection deepened into self-examination. Alexander considered the cost of becoming larger than life. The myth that surrounded him offered protection, but it also obscured understanding. He wondered whether he was still shaping the story, or whether the story had begun to shape him. Change appeared in moments of restraint. Decisions were slower, more deliberate. Emotion was present, but measured. The intensity that once burned outward now turned inward, refining rather than consuming. Experience had taught patience, though not without strain. Patterns across his reign became clearer. Power expanded quickly, but meaning required time. Fear could secure obedience, but trust sustained rule. Alexander recognized these truths more fully now, even as mastering them remained elusive. As this chapter settles into quiet, the night feels reflective and steady. The journey has turned inward, toward governance, memory, and identity. Alexander continues forward, carrying not only an empire, but the quiet understanding that conquest leaves questions no victory can fully answer. The world Alexander now ruled no longer moved with him alone. It moved through systems, through people who carried his authority into places he could not always reach. The night felt broader again, not because of distance, but because of responsibility spreading outward. Power had become something to maintain, not simply to wield. Daily life within the empire required constant attention. Messages traveled across long roads, carrying requests, disputes, and reports. Governors balanced local custom with imperial expectation. Alexander listened carefully, knowing that distance could distort intent. Rule demanded patience now, a different kind of endurance than marching or battle. Belief continued to shape perception. To many, Alexander was no longer merely a king. He had become a symbol of order, continuity, and change. This perception strengthened loyalty, but it also raised expectations. Symbols, once established, resist simplification. They grow beyond the control of those they represent. Unease surfaced as tension grew between Macedonian traditions and the customs of newly integrated cultures. Efforts to unify created friction. What felt inclusive to some felt threatening to others. Alexander navigated these divides deliberately, aware that unity imposed too forcefully could fracture rather than bind. Pressure gathered within his closest circle. Long-standing companions questioned the pace and direction of change. Disagreements surfaced quietly at first, then more openly. Alexander responded with firmness, but the emotional weight of these moments lingered. Leadership now required difficult distance from those once closest. Human reactions varied across the empire. Some embraced stability, others resisted subtly, holding tightly to older identities. Alexander recognized these responses as natural. Change, he had learned, was never neutral. It always carried cost, even when guided by vision. Reflection deepened in moments of isolation. Alexander considered how power reshaped relationships.
The closeness he once shared with his men was harder to sustain. Authority created space even when he resisted it. This realization brought a quiet sense of loss. Change appeared in how Alexander asserted control. Decisions were enforced more clearly, boundaries drawn more firmly. Compassion remained, but it was balanced by necessity. Experience had taught him that hesitation at this scale could unravel order quickly. Patterns became visible across history itself. Empires expanded, stabilized, and strained under their own weight. Alexander sensed that he was now part of this larger rhythm. His actions echoed those of rulers before him, even as he tried to shape a different outcome. As this chapter eases into stillness, the night feels steady but heavy. The empire stands vast and interconnected, held together by intention and effort. Alexander moves forward within it, aware that the challenge ahead is no longer conquest but coherence, and that maintaining unity may demand more than any battle he has faced before.
The pace of movement slowed, not from weakness, but from weight. The empire Alexander carried now pressed inward, shaping his days and narrowing his nights. The stillness that surrounded him felt earned yet uneasy, as though the world itself was holding something back. Power had reached its widest form, and with it came a quieter kind of tension. Life within the court reflected this shift. Ceremonies grew longer, decisions more layered. Advisors spoke carefully, measuring each word. Alexander listened more than he spoke, aware that every expression could ripple outward. Authority no longer announced itself through motion. It rested in judgment, in restraint, in timing. Belief continued to evolve around him. To some, Alexander appeared invincible, protected by fate itself. To others, he seemed increasingly distant, shaped by customs no longer familiar. These perceptions existed side by side, creating a fragile balance. Alexander understood that belief could strengthen unity, but it could also isolate. Unease surfaced in subtle ways. Physical exhaustion lingered beneath resolve. Old wounds reminded him of time's presence. Moments of reflection grew longer, quieter. The future, once imagined as endless expansion, now appeared as a space requiring care rather than conquest. Pressure accumulated around legacy. Alexander had built something vast, but its shape beyond his presence remained uncertain. Institutions existed, but cohesion still depended heavily on him. This realization settled slowly, carrying a quiet urgency that no campaign could resolve. Human reactions reflected this uncertainty. Loyalty remained strong, yet questions circulated softly. What would come after? How would balance be maintained? Alexander did not offer answers easily. Some questions, he sensed, could not yet be spoken aloud. Reflection deepened into contemplation of mortality, not as fear, but as awareness. The body, once trusted without question, now required attention. Energy came and went unpredictably. Alexander noticed these changes, accepting them without alarm, but not without thought. Change appeared in his demeanor. He grew more measured, less driven by impulse. Authority remained firm, but it was quieter now. Experience had softened sharp edges without dulling resolve. The fire within him still burned, but it illuminated rather than consumed. Patterns across his life aligned with broader human experience. Youth surged forward, power expanded outward, maturity turned inward. Alexander recognized this rhythm instinctively, even as he resisted its final implications. As this chapter settles into silence, the night feels close and reflective. The empire stands complete, yet fragile, shaped by will and circumstance alike. Alexander remains at its center, carrying the weight of what he has built, aware that the story is approaching a threshold where movement gives way to stillness and questions begin to outnumber answers. The days in Babylon unfolded with a strange calm, as if the world had paused without fully stopping. The city itself was vast and layered, filled with sounds that blended into one another until they became a low, constant murmur. Alexander moved through this space with familiarity and distance at once, present yet inward, carrying a stillness shaped by years of motion. Daily life returned to routine in form, but not in feeling. Meetings were held, plans discussed, celebrations prepared. The structure of rule continued, steady and functional. Yet beneath these patterns, something subtle had shifted. Time felt heavier, moments lingered longer than before, as though asking to be noticed. Belief surrounded Alexander in conflicting forms. Some spoke of him as eternal, chosen by fate, protected beyond ordinary limits. Others, quieter and more cautious, sensed the vulnerability beneath the legend. Alexander himself did not speak of these things. He listened, observed, and allowed uncertainty to exist without resistance. Unease entered gently, not as fear, but as awareness. His body responded differently to strain. Fatigue arrived sooner, departed more slowly. Small discomforts lingered. Alexander noticed these changes with curiosity rather than alarm, as if studying another transition rather than confronting an end. Pressure gathered quietly around expectation. New campaigns were discussed, further consolidation planned. The future, in theory, remained expansive, yet Alexander felt a narrowing between intention and capacity. This space did not frighten him, it invited reflection. Human reactions around him remained respectful, even reverent. Companions watched closely, careful not to disturb balance. Conversations softened. Laughter became less frequent, but more sincere. Presence mattered more than urgency. Reflection deepened into acceptance. Alexander considered the arc of his life not as unfinished, but as fully lived. Movement had defined him, but stillness now offered its own clarity. He did not withdraw from responsibility, but he no longer rushed toward possibility. Change appeared in his attention to detail. Small gestures, quiet decisions, moments of connection held greater meaning. Authority expressed itself through calm rather than command. The myth surrounding him continued to grow, even as the man within it grew quieter. Patterns aligned gently. Rise, expansion, consolidation, pause. Alexander sensed himself within this rhythm, neither resisting nor embracing it fully. Awareness replaced ambition as the dominant presence in his thoughts. As this chapter fades, the night in Babylon feels deep and close. The world remains intact, awaiting direction, yet something essential has slowed. Alexander stands at the edge of silence, not in retreat, but in transition, carrying the calm understanding that every great movement must eventually come to rest, and that the final chapter approaches not with noise, but with breath. The final days arrived without announcement. There was no clear moment when movement stopped and stillness began. It happened gradually, like dusk settling over a familiar place. Babylon continued its rhythm, unaware that history was slowing within its walls. Alexander remained present, attentive, yet quieter than before, as if listening to something beyond the city's sounds. Daily life carried on gently around him. Advisors came and went. Plans rested on tables, unfinished but not urgent. The structure of rule remained intact, almost effortlessly. It was as though the empire itself had learned to breathe on its own, guided by habits formed over years of intention and will. Belief surrounded Alexander in layered silence. Some waited for recovery, convinced that strength would return as it always had. Others sensed the fragility beneath calm. Stories spread softly, not as proclamations, but as murmurs. Alexander did not confirm or deny them. He existed within the moment, allowing uncertainty to remain. Unease entered not as fear, but as clarity. The body no longer responded as expected. Energy faded, then returned briefly, then faded again. Alexander observed these changes with composure. There was no struggle, no visible resistance, only awareness, steady and unforced. Pressure lifted quietly. The need to decide, to move, to expand loosened its grip. Responsibility remained, but urgency dissolved. Alexander's presence became still, centered, as though the journey outward had finally turned inward completely. Human reactions softened around him. Voices lowered, movements slowed. Companions stayed close without speaking much. Connection existed without explanation. In these moments, words felt unnecessary. History, for once, allowed silence. Reflection settled deeply. Alexander's life did not replay in images of conquest alone, but in moments of understanding, lessons learned, bonds formed, limits encountered. The fire that once drove him across continents now warmed rather than pushed. Completion did not feel like loss. It felt like quiet arrival. Change appeared as release. The myth remained, vast and growing, but the man within it rested. Identity no longer needed definition. Titles faded into memory. What remained was presence, simple and human. Patterns resolved themselves gently. Birth, ambition, movement, transformation, stillness. Alexander sensed his place within this rhythm without resistance. The world he shaped would continue to change, fragment, rebuild, and remember him in ways beyond his control. As the night deepens for the final time, the story does not end loudly. It fades. The empire breathes on. History turns its page softly. And somewhere between memory and silence, Alexander of Macedon becomes what he always was becoming, a story told, a presence felt, a life that passes into quiet. And now, as the darkness settles and your thoughts slow, let this story rest with you. If you wish to continue drifting through the past, through lives shaped by time and silence, stay here. This is Let Me Tell You, and when you are ready, another story will be waiting.